Well, it sure has been interesting lately to be a Silent Hill fan. Not only did we get the Silent Hill 2 remake last year, but also the announcement this year that they're working on giving the first game the same treatment. Along with there being the upcoming and questionable looking Return to Silent Hill movie not too far off, along with the standalone title, the short message released as well. Now there's another game to add to that list with Silent Hill F, a new entry that Konami are even calling Mainline, developed by Taiwanese devs Neobards Entertainment. This thing's been out for a few days now, and every man and their dog seems to be singing its high praises, with it even scoring in the high 80s on Metacritic and having a very positive rating on Steam. So let's talk about it, shall we? If only so I can justify the $130 dues I had to spend on this thing to play it early. I will say as well, the game's been out for a few days now, so there's going to be a few spoilers in this video. Nothing too major, but just a few mechanics and stuff that I talk about that's in some of the later game content. So if you are worried about that, then be sure to keep an eye on the screen for the time skips so you can get right past this stuff. You got that? Having said that, let's get into it. Right, so this was a bit of an interesting experience for me to play through in the sense that while I am a Silent Hill fan, my love of the series really only extends to those first 3 games. I mean, I reckon that original trilogy is pretty much perfect, and everything else that came after it I consider to be mostly pointless and unnecessary. So going into this, I had practically zero expectations, neither high or low. And it is interesting right off the bat how it doesn't really have anything to do with the other games. You know, the ones set in the town that the whole series is named after. Instead, it's set in a fictional Japanese village in the 1960s, with the only real element connecting everything together being that there's lots of fog. Weird things happen and you kill monsters with a metal pipe. Oh yeah, and at one point you go through a high school. And speaking of, the protagonist is one of the students, a 15-year-old girl named Hinako, who, along with her friends Shu, Rinko, and Sakuko, find themselves trying to get out of town once the place is engulfed by that very familiar-looking mysterious fog, along with the weird growth that seems to bring all these horrible creatures along with it. And apart from that, there are some very similar thematic elements as well, reminiscent of the older games, in the sense that at the center of all of this is themes of pain, trauma, and emotional abuse, along with allusions towards drug use. Hanako's parents are also shown to be pretty toxic. I mean, her father is a nasty drunk, for instance, having lost all of his savings in a restaurant venture. And then the mum is completely apathetic in regards to how the dad treats her. You could probably make comparisons with Hanako to Alyssa and Heather in the old games in the sense that they're both these super vulnerable young women in a pretty crappy situation. Though, I think Heather and Alyssa definitely had it worse off than Hanako did.
No, not again.
Either way though, my point is that she works pretty well as a protagonist. And it's a scientific fact that some of the best survival horror titles have women as the main characters. What I do have an issue with though is how this thing tackles that concept of the other world or that spirit realm that seems to run parallel to the events in the real world. Because this time it tackles it a whole lot differently, in that it's more or less a completely disconnected place from reality. In all of the other games, it was treated as this alternate version of the real world, which is why you'd see very similar looking environments like hospitals and schools, only with a much more nightmarish appearance. And in the case of that Silent Hill 2 remake, you'd even see the shift in real time as James would cross over and then suddenly find himself in this new and unsettling place. In F though, it happens in a much more disconnecting way, usually with Hanako falling asleep or passing out and then waking up in a place that looks nothing like where she's just been. That evil influence can still be felt and seen when she's out in the real world though, but it just never seems to connect these in a seamless manner like the other Silent Hill games did. You know, you're either here or you're there. And as a result, stuff like that iconic air raid siren is just completely missing. And while that might be fine to have it change this much, like, it really doesn't feel like Silent Hill in that way. I mean, at this point, it's just a Silent Hill game in name only. First, I couldn't really understand why so many people were glossing over this, but then it started to make sense when I looked into the writer a little bit more. And I've seen quite a few people online saying that they're more excited to play this simply for the fact that this guy, Ryokishio7, wrote it, you know, as opposed to it actually being a new Silent Hill entry. And I honestly do think there's an element of people there that are just giving props to this thing based off that alone. as opposed to how the story is actually told, or if it all connects up in any kind of grand sense. Also, maybe the fact that it's Japanese, and there does seem to be a tendency for a lot of people to just praise this kind of offbeat storytelling by default. And yeah, look, I do get it, and in the game's defense, visually and thematically, there's some interesting and bizarre moments here that we've never seen in this series before. In fact, ironically, as much as I was disappointed in how this thing was so far removed from the other entries, the main thing that really kept me going was the story, and wanting to find out what was going on and how things are going to get resolved. Sure doesn't have a lack of cinematics in that regard either, man, and for what feels like half of the game, it's like you can't move around for more than 2 minutes without then sitting through another cinematic that's just as long. Visually, Silent Hill F does look pretty damn good at times, with some nice looking environments and a whole lot of attention to detail, to the point that it can often be confusing to tell what you can and can't walk over at a glance. That effect during those moments when that evil growth thing starts to take over really is kind of unsettling, and some of those more spiritual environments look great too. Weapons also break over time the more you use them, and I really love how you can see them coming apart and breaking in real time with each hit. Plus, I really like how the main menu gets more and more overgrown the further you've gotten into the story. And yeah, and as the campaign goes on, Hinako starts to look more bruised and battered as well, with her uniform showing visible signs of damage from all these frequent attacks. And then the way that it often seamlessly blends into gameplay at the end of a cinematic as the camera sweeps around behind her is a neat trick too.
Not bad at all.
Now, it really feels like games are at that point now where there's no difference between the pre-rendered stuff and then the in-game stuff. Well, mostly. And the reason that I say mostly is because this is another 2025 game that happens to run on the Unreal Engine 5. Yeah, which, as you'd expect, means it has more issues than Mad Magazine. And while I haven't had the kind of performance dramas it seems a lot of other people have, one thing that has annoyed me is how for some reason the FPS limit is set to 60. In fact, by default, it's actually 30, but the maximum without any kind of tweak or a mod is currently capped at 60. And even then, despite what you've set it to, the cinematics still seem to be at 30, so you get this really jarring effect when it transitions between the two. I get that they've done this for it to work on the consoles and all that, but this kind of thing just shouldn't be happening on the PC, dog, especially in 2025. Fuck! Now, like all of the other Silent Hill games, F does take a little bit of time there to pick up some speed. You got that first half hour or so where things slowly descend into madness with a pretty lame scripted chase scene against the fog monster, along with my absolute pet peeve, slowly shuffling through narrow gaps. But before too long, you start coming up against these mannequin and scarecrow-looking enemies that form up the vast majority of the hostiles you're going to face for the next 12 or so hours, along with another one that's more or less the licker from Resident Evil, only reacting to the sound you make. After you spend a fair bit of time in the apparent real world trying to get out of town with your friends is around the point where Hinako passes out, and then wakes up in F's version of the other world, where her only guide is a mysterious dude wearing a fox mask. Now, instead of using metal pipes and crowbars, you've got more traditional Japanese weapons like a kaiken and a naginata. And then from that point on, you're constantly going back and forth between both of these settings, where the real-world situation's focusing on Hanako and her buddies, and then the other ones which are far more metaphorical, relying heavily on symbolism and other ambiguous storytelling elements, trying to give us a bit more backstory and explaining the real relationships she's got with her family and friends, none of which really seem all that healthy. The main thing connecting both of these, though, is that none of them really feel all that scary. And while I know that a big part of the horror in these games is the implied and the stuff you don't see, F just never really felt like it was conjuring up those same feelings of dread or despair. Especially not in the way that Silent Hill 1, 2, or 3 did. I will say on a positive note though that a lot of the puzzles in this game really are quite tricky at times, though it does often skate that thin line between being well crafted but then just completely nonsensical. With this scarecrow puzzle, for instance, being a pretty good example and giving me a whole lot of grief there on my first run. Yeah, so what you're supposed to do here is read these clues and then ascertain which of these figures you need to interact with. But if you pick the wrong one, you wake the damn thing up, and then have to either avoid it or kill it. And it's just that the clues for which is the right pick are so vague that for a couple of these, I just eventually had to guess.
Surprise, cockbags!
But then again, I guess that's the whole point. You know, puzzles are supposed to be confusing in survival horror. And if everything was blatantly obvious from the get-go, well, then there'd be no challenge there at all. I do think it's kind of interesting as well how it defaults to the puzzles being on hard mode from the beginning, which apparently is the way the devs want you to experience things, compared to the combat, which is on story mode. And yeah, that does bring me on to what is by far the biggest dilemma I have with Silent Hill F, and that's the combat.
Surprise, motherfucker!
Now, having seen all that preview footage they were showing, the main worry I had here was that Hanako would be too strong, just mashing through droves of monsters with complete ease. Well, I'm happy to say that that's not the case, and in fact, if you're playing on hard mode, it's actually quite the opposite. And the game does a really good job of making you feel super fragile, with every single enemy you encounter absolutely able to kill you if you're not paying attention. Resulting in some pretty chaotic and tense encounters where you're really fighting for your life. The problem is that it's an entirely melee-based system, which plays to some very stringent rules that you pretty much have to abide by. And look, I get that putting guns into this game would have been incredibly out of place. I mean, you're playing as a schoolgirl, and it's unlikely she'd have access to firearms, but then even also more unlikely that she'd even know how to use them if she did. So what they've instead done is take that same 15-year-old girl and limit her options to metal pipes, knives, and baseball bats, all of which she can use with lethal precision because, yeah, that's far more believable. And yeah, the people who defend why Hanako isn't able to use firearms probably have no issue with the fact that she's somehow able to beat back all these horrific monsters with a crowbar. Anyway, all of that stuff aside, you've got three things to worry about here. You've got your health, your stamina, and your sanity. Basically, the way it works is you've got a standard attack and then a heavy attack, with the latter one having a chance to stun enemies and leave them vulnerable, both of which use stamina. With the heavy attack also doubling as a counter, if timed correctly during certain and very specific enemy animations. In a nutshell, it's kind of like enemies are going to glitch out for a second, and you've got that very brief window to hit that heavy attack to counter for massive damage. The thing is, though, is that it becomes a matter of really just waiting for these moments, considering enemies can ignore your combos otherwise, making your basic attacks kind of pointless, especially on hard mode where you take so much damage. Which all then means that it just becomes a matter of learning these various attack patterns for every single enemy type, and then just waiting for the right moment to counter. The catch, though, is that they've also got other attacks which can't be countered, which instead requires you to dodge, adding in this whole other shtick where you can perfect dodge if timed correctly, restoring all of your stamina. Yeah, you even get this slow motion effect when you pull this off, because yeah, it seems every game these days has to have this feature. And it does kind of remove that whole horror aspect to the survival horror thing, considering once you get the hang of this stuff, you can take out most of the enemies pretty easily. But more than that, it just feels like more of an action game now than anything else.
Oh, you miserable bags of bones!
There's about half a dozen weapons all up here, and outside of the speed of them, I didn't really see all that much of a difference. I mean, the sledgehammer and the axe are a lot slower, obviously, than using something like the bat or the sickle. But at the end of the day, I just ended up using whatever felt the most responsive, which was often the knife or the crowbar. Yeah, and I do think it's funny how regardless of what weapon you've actually got equipped at that time, it's always going to show Hanako holding the pipe in the cutscenes. Just like she's always ready to dish out some smoke. As for this whole sanity system, well, that one's a bit of a misnomer because it doesn't actually seem to affect your mental well-being or anything in that regard. More so, it's just the name they've given to this meter that lets you focus. And this is important because when you're focusing, it makes it easier to counter those enemy attacks. Plus, if you hold down the focus button for long enough, it's going to charge up a more powerful hit, which almost always guarantees a stun, all of which is vastly superior to just using those basic attacks.
Boy!
And then to make it even more confusing, you get a whole bunch of different consumables which refill all of these different meters, with things like chocolate bars, jelly, and drinks. Oh yeah, and you need to manually bind these things to shortcuts as well. For some reason, you simply can't open your inventory and consume them, which is a bit odd. Or I don't know, maybe they're forcing you to do this so you have to heal during combat. You know, like a certain other game series. All of the manual save points in the game are shrines where you can choose to sell some of these off to earn so-called faith points, which can then be spent to upgrade Hinako's health, stamina, and even her sanity bar. You can even find and equip these Omamari talisman things, which buff up aspects like your health and stamina even further. Oh yeah, and by the way, is all of this starting to sound a bit bizarre? Well, maybe that's because it is. And I don't want to jump on the whole bandwagon and call this thing Souls-like, but I am getting a bit sick and tired of how every single game these days seems like it has to have these kind of mechanics. Mechanics you have to utilize or else you are going to die. And in fact, the boss fights lean even more into this stuff, outright forcing you to learn these specific moves through trial and error, and then overcoming them through what's more or less rote memorization. One of the boss fights later on is against two enemies at once, a humongous fat one and then a smaller, more nimble one. And I'm getting flashbacks to fighting Ornstein and Smaug all over again. And I'm not saying that these boss fights are bad or poorly designed in that sense, but it just adds more fuel to that fire of this feeling less and less like a Silent Hill game. I know that some of the later titles like Silent Hill 4 and Homecoming had more of a focus on the melee, but if we're at a point where we're using those games as a positive comparison, then we truly are lost. In fact, I remember that with Homecoming specifically, that thing was universally disliked by the fans, for how much of an emphasis it put on all that melee stuff. Dipping a bit now into spoiler territory as well, I feel I need to talk about these bits later on in the game, where, for story-related reasons, Hanako's now got a giant fox arm replacing those standard weapons, where you've even got the ability to absorb the souls of fallen enemies to then power up a rage mode where you do increased damage. And yes, that classic Silent Hill feeling combat loop of using a clawed arm to slash apart enemies. Some people might say, but G-Man, you don't have to engage with that stuff and you can just run right past the enemies. It's survival horror. And yes, while that is true and you often can do that when you're outside, during certain other areas you're outright forced into combat. Like it's gonna literally have an objective to defeat all the monsters before you can proceed.
Come on now, dawg.
There's that enemy I mentioned earlier that can detect the sounds you make, kinda like the lickers in Resident Evil. But the amount of times you're actually able to avoid these things by being stealthy, I think you can count on one hand. Most of the time they're immediately hostile and it seems impossible to actually lose them. And yes, I'm sure that people are going to post speedruns where they dodge every single enemy in the game and all that stuff, which is fine, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about someone playing this for the first or second time, where you're simply not going to be able to do any of that stuff or even know about it. In fact, the last hour or so of the game is almost entirely comprised of combat-focused areas. It doesn't add in anything new or interesting, it just puts you into this constant combat loop against the same enemies you've been fighting for the past 10 hours. Plus, it often reuses some of the tougher enemies if for no other reason than to just pad these fights out and make the story take longer.
Come on, man.
And it's just like, if you remove that important survival horror aspect of having the player choose whether to run or fight and then just force them to fight, well, you remove one of the biggest aspects of the whole genre. Where it's at its worst though is all the combat inside these narrow hallways and corridors where you've got bugger all room to move around, along with the camera making things even trickier. Yeah, the kind of thing that really makes you wish for fixed camera angles. I don't know, I guess on a positive side, at least we've got the most obnoxious hit stop I think I've ever seen in a video game. Oh yeah, and what also annoys me here is how if you ever attack something too close to a wall, the weapon's gonna deflect off it and cancel out the hit, which, you know, is of course a handicap that doesn't affect the enemies. Enemies also have this tendency to do a grab attack where they latch onto you and knock off a sizable chunk of your health bar. And I've lost count the amount of times that this has happened from around a corner or a nearby doorway where I pretty much couldn't do anything but eat my own shit. The solution to that, I guess, is you should be looking around every single corner, but do you really want to play the entire game doing that? Nothing else, at least on New Game Plus mode, you're likely to know that this stuff is coming, most of the time. And it is true that F really does improve over time with repeat playthroughs, because, like a lot of the other games in the series, when you unlock something or get an upgrade, it carries over. In fact, there's even again multiple endings in there as well, with the player able to access different routes based on their actions. I actually like it too, how if you try to skip a cinematic in New Game Plus mode that has new content you've not seen before, it outright lets you know, which is a really handy feature that saves you having to rewatch stuff you've already seen. Plus, I like the way that it changes around a few mechanics, like for instance, you get that fox something a lot earlier on than you did in the first run, outright letting you skip over some huge sections from those more tedious areas. But to be honest, I'm really not all that interested, and I gotta say that Silent Hill F, it just didn't grab me the way some of the other titles did. It all kind of reminds me of the same experience I had with Alan Wake 2, where I went into that thing and had my own personal experience with it, which I thought was largely lackluster, only to then go online and see everyone else dick riding it into oblivion, making me wonder if I'd played the same thing they did. I think my main grievance here at the end of the day is just, if you're gonna make a game in a very popular series, which is known for some specific key elements and plot devices, and then you essentially rework or remove almost all of them, then it just makes me kind of wonder why they'd name it after that series to begin with. And I think the reason this has all been done is just to appeal to brand recognition, which, knowing Konami, is the most logical reason. I mean, for instance, while there's definitely good reasons for why they remade MGS3 before MGS1, what is also absolutely a big component is that they know it's the most popular game in the series, and therefore the safest one they could have remade.
Pretty good.
You know, for the exact same reason they chose to remake Silent Hill 2 over Silent Hill 1. Recent events, though, that remake included, have made me realise that most Silent Hill fans don't really care all that much about what they're actually playing, as long as it's just got Silent Hill in the title. And that's fine. Look, at the end of the day, I don't give a shit if people like something more than I do. I guess I just wish the game named Silent Hill had, you know, more Silent Hill stuff in it, along with not requiring me to perfect dodge and parry my way through an entire underworld of hideous monsters. I will give it props in one way though, in that it's still better than Silent Hill 4.